It started with the crunch of gravel under tires, slow, deliberate, like someone wanted to be heard. Out here, miles from the nearest town. You learn to tell the difference between a neighbor checking on you and strangers who mean business. I looked out the cabin window and saw the flashing lights first. Not the harsh red and blue of the county sheriff, but cheap knockoffs that flickered unevenly in the early dusk. 3 men stepped out, all wearing uniforms that looked just a little too crisp. 2 staged badges that caught the light but didn't feel right. They claimed they were law enforcement, here to inspect my property. But the tone in their voices told a different story, one that smelled more like intimidation than public safety. I knew exactly who had sent them. The HOA, a group that had been trying to bully me off this land for months. They didn't like that I wouldn't play by their rules. I didn't mow my meadow flat, didn't pay for their so-called security patrol, and I sure didn't let them tell me who could visit. What they didn't know, what no one in that smug boardroom knew, was that I wasn't just some hermit with a stubborn streak. A few of us from the old Platoon had been keeping quiet tabs on the HOA for a while now. Let's just say their security team had crossed the wrong people before. We'd seen the shady bookkeeping, the harassment tactics, the way they picked their targets, and we were patient. Very patient, as the fake cops pushed their way toward the porch. One of them gave a signal to the others, like they were ready to ransack the place. My pulse slowed, not from fear, but from calculation. I wasn't alone. Somewhere out in the tree line, I knew 2 sets of eyes were watching, waiting for my cue. The men didn't realize they weren't here on their terms anymore. They were stepping straight into the middle of something that had been in motion for weeks, and by the time they figured it out, it would already be too late. Most people think of an HOA as a group that sends you letters about your grass being too tall or your fence being the wrong color. Ours was different. They had money more than a group of neighborhood volunteers should have. They also had influence. People who stood up to them suddenly found their mail misplaced, their properties inspected, and in a few cases, their homes mysteriously damaged. And yet, whenever anyone tried to bring it up at a meeting, the conversation would get shut down, the minutes would go missing, and the person speaking would stop showing up entirely. I'd stayed quiet at first. I'd bought this cabin for the solitude, not for a fight. But things started to shift about a year ago when my buddy Carter, one of my old Platoon brothers, moved into a house just inside the HOA's borders. Within months, they were on him for violations that didn't exist. They even tried to fine him for having the wrong type of blinds in his windows. Carter knew how to handle pressure, but I could tell they were wearing him down. That's when we started comparing notes. Turned out, a lot of people in the area had similar stories, and the pattern was too perfect to be an accident. We began looking deeper, not in a reckless way, but with the same patience we'd learned in the field. We mapped their routines, noted who they targeted, and traced connections between certain board members and private contractors. That's when we found something that explained the whole operation: a series of payments, labeled as security expenditures, that led to a company no one could identify. And now, standing there in my yard, I was looking at 3 men who fit the exact description we'd been tracking for months. Same vehicles, same patches on their uniforms, same smug expressions that said they believed the badge on their chest gave them control. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't just about my cabin anymore. Every step they took brought them deeper into a trap we'd been setting without them knowing. Out in the darkening woods, a branch snapped not from the wind, but from someone moving into position. And I could feel it. The real game was about to begin. The man in frontal, with a jaw that looked carved out of stone, stepped closer and demanded I authorize their entry. His voice carried that hollow authority of someone who'd rehearsed it in a mirror. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let my eyes drift past him, scanning the tree line. Carter was out there somewhere, and if I knew him, He was already sighting in every angle of the yard. The fake cops shifted, restless. One of them tapped his flashlight against his thigh, glancing back toward their SUV like he was waiting for some kind of signal that told me two things. They weren't confident and they weren't alone. My gut said there was a backup vehicle parked just out of sight. If the HOA had learned anything from their last visit to a neighbor, it was to come prepared. I kept my voice steady, casual, asking for identification. That's when the tall one smiled a thin, knowing curl of the lips and said, "You're already in violation. Don't make this harder than it has to be." It was the same phrase the HOA president had used in her last email to me. Too specific. To be coincidence? Somewhere behind me, inside the cabin, my old field journal sat open on the table. Inside were weeks of notes, timestamps, license plates, and maps of their movements. Every shred of it was proof, but it wasn't time to use it yet. If I showed my hand too early, they'd vanish like smoke. While the standoff held in my yard, another angle of the conflict was playing out. Down in the valley, our third man Race was tailing a black pickup that had left the HOA offices 30 minutes ago. He'd been sending me updates in short-coded bursts. The truck was headed toward the ridge road that looped behind my property. If it parked there, they'd have high ground, and that made me uneasy. The wind carried the faint hum of an engine straining uphill. The three men in my yard didn't react, which meant they weren't expecting that vehicle. That detail lodged in my mind like a splinter. Whatever was coming next. It wasn't part of their plan. The hum of that engine grew louder, winding its way up the ridge road like a fuse burning towards something explosive. The tall man in front of me noticed my eyes shift, and for the first time, his confident stance wavered. He turned his head just slightly, as if listening, and that tiny break in his focus told me everything. I wasn't the only one on edge. Carter's voice crackled faintly in my earpiece, low enough that only I could hear. "Vehicles not HOA, unknown, moving fast." My grip tightened on the porch railing. If it wasn't their people, then someone else was stepping into this standoff. And I had no idea whose side they were on. The man with the flashlight stepped forward now, putting himself between me and the door. "Sir, we're going inside," he said, though his voice had lost that perfect rehearsal. I didn't move. Out in the tree line, I caught the faintest flicker of a shadow Carter repositioning. The temperature seemed to drop, though maybe that was just my pulse slowing as my mind calculated every possible outcome. A minute dragged out like an hour. Then came the first sign of real panic. The driver of their SUV leaned out the window, gesturing frantically toward the road. The tall man muttered something under his breath, and suddenly all three of them were scanning the dark like prey, sensing a predator. From the valley, Reyes's update came in quick bursts. Truck, stopping. 2 people, gearing back. I pictured the ridge road in my mind. There were only a few pull-offs that gave a clear view of my cabin. Whoever was in that truck had picked one of them. Then headlights cut through the trees, spilling pale light across the yard. The SUV's engine roared to life, but the 3 men didn't retreat. They held their ground, like they were caught between orders and instinct. The air was thick enough to taste. Carter's shadow moved again, closer now, and my hand hovered just above the signal we'd agreed on. Everything weeks of planning, months of quiet observation was teetering right on the edge. One more step from any of us, and the whole thing would ignite. The headlights from the ridge cut sharper now, angling down until they landed square on the 3 men in my yard. For a second, it was just blinding white against their uniforms, and then a voice echoed from the dark. Not a shout, just a calm, steady call that carried far in the still air. "You're not supposed to be here." It wasn't a voice I recognized. The tall man stiffened, his jaw tightening. Without looking at me, he murmured something to his partners, and I caught the edge of a single word. "Abort." But they didn't move. The SUV's driver revved the engine again, impatient, while the flashlight man shifted his stance like he was bracing for something to break loose. Carter's voice crackled in my ear. Urgent now. That's not locals, and they're armed. Hum of the Ridge truck's engine cut abruptly, replaced by the metallic clink of a door swinging open. Two figures stepped into view, their outlines backlit in the glare. One carried what looked like a case-long rectangular, the kind you didn't bring unless you had serious plans. The other kept their hands in their jacket pockets, moving with the slow confidence of someone who didn't need to rush. Reyes's next message hit like a gut punch. Plates on that truck federal issue, no match for HOA contractors. That changed everything. If they weren't HOA, then who had been watching us all this time? And more importantly, whose side were they really on? The men in my yard shifted again, caught between the cabin and the ridge, between whatever mission they'd been sent to do and whoever had just rolled in. The flashlight beam swung toward the tree line, sweeping dangerously close to Carter's position. My mind was racing now. If the ridge crew was here for TH,